do, since it's the end of 2021, I thought I'd go through some of the transitions from the past year that I didn't show you. Like Steve Jobs and Walt Disney and Prince Philip. I think I've done maybe 80 something on the channel so far, but I've done many, many more. Some refused. Some said, like Carrie Fisher or Helen Keller, no thank you, not interested. And I couldn't get any pictures for them at all. And others were just baffling. Like, for example, Steve Jobs. When I did his transition pictures, he arrived in the usual symbolic cavern I always see, which is purely metaphorical, but he arrived and he was a tiny little figure in this amazingly huge cavernous space, which usually means in the pictures, you know, there's no greatness in death. Everybody is the same. You may enter it from the mortal side like a giant, as he did. He changed human technological history. But when you get to the other side, the greatness ends and you become just like anybody else. Into this cavern, up the tunnel, and so on. However, halfway up the tunnel, something extraordinary happened, and dark and baffling. As he was walking, it turned black. And all these hands emerged from the floor, like oily hands or something, just dark, grasping, grabby hands, and tried to grab a hold of him as he went. And my only thought about that, even though I still don't know what it meant, my only thought was he made a lot of enemies in his lifetime by being so brash, by being argumentative and angry. And maybe these were the people he'd upset along the way. Maybe these were regrets he had. Things he wished he'd not said, things he wished he'd not done. And all these hands were holding him back to the mortal because they represented unfinished business. That's what I thought. But it seems so dark and so bleak for somebody as revered as Steve Jobs. By contrast, a lot of people ask for Aleister Crowley. Now, Aleister Crowley was the occultist and magician. He was a mountaineer. He started his own religion. He was a jack of all trades, this guy. And I did his pictures many, many months ago and instantly disliked him as a person. He arrived in the same metaphorical cavern and he immediately drew with his foot a circle in the sand and said, "Those are my rules. That's the game I'm playing. And everybody must fit in with that." His ego was colossal. His sense of delusion was huge. He was dictating to the universe how things would go. You've got to show this sucker who's boss. That sort of attitude, which of course is incredibly arrogant. And when he got to the tunnel, he was still going, yeah, you know, I'm an intellectual giant. I don't deserve to be treated like everybody else. I demand special preferential treatment. And you don't get that in this process. Everybody is equal. And in the end, when he realized that his will was not strong enough to beat the universe's, of course, he just goes limp and goes, "Oh," very dramatic, very diva-ish. "Oh, take me, do what you will. I am powerless now." It was all a performance and all incredibly unpleasant. And as he went up the tunnel, there were these spindles, you know, butter rollers. You know those metal devices that you scrape across butter and it turns them into little curls? It was like that. There was a bunch of them taking all this ego stuff, this pomposity, this arrogance, this sense of entitlement, and this intellectual giant attitude he had, stripping it all away. Like his very flesh was being torn from his body. Of course, he had no body. This is just his consciousness. But the removal of his ego self left him broken. And when he got to this dome of light that I always see when I go into these kind of pictures, he just lay on the edge of it and went, oh, I'm too tired to go on. And basically he just rolled into the light. I can't be bothered anymore. Because he'd lost his power. Essentially, he'd never had any power in the first place. It was all delusional. It was all made up. But because he'd lost his imagined power, then his ego had nothing to live for. And his consciousness simply gave up and he rolled away into the light. So that was Aleister Crowley, a very unpleasant, self-absorbed man. But there were other unpleasant ones too, but in different ways. For example, Wafa Idris. She was the very first, I believe, female Palestinian suicide bomber. Went in Jerusalem, blew a few people up, including herself, and died a martyr in Palestinian terms. But when I went into the pictures for her, she was actually stuck. The rock would not let her out. And it felt as though the rock represented her belief system, her meta-narrative, the outlook on life that was unshakable in its confidence, and yet completely erroneous in terms of how it fitted into the path of higher intention, which is love, compassion, and so on. I mean, forgiveness, whatever. It was almost like those things were not as important to her as her belief system. And she wasn't terribly political, apparently, in her lifetime, and yet she'd been brought up in an environment where she could be coaxed into blowing herself up on principle. And so when she finally managed to work herself free from the wall of the cavern, she was almost arthritic as she tried to raise herself up. Her bones were fossilized almost. So rigid was she in her outlook on life. But she walks across the symbolic cave, I always see, and as she looked up, there were a bunch of legs, pairs of legs, swinging from a cavity in the ceiling. It was gruesome, but it meant something to her because she was instantly filled with, first of all, recognition of what this was and who those people were, but also filled with regret that what she had done had led to so much grief and unhappiness. And yet there was nothing she could do. Her stiff, arthritic body was forced to go through this process. And indeed, as she went up the tunnel, there were red rods across the tunnel. Osama bin Laden had exactly the same thing. Only as this woman went through the rods, it broke her ankles. She fell to the ground afterwards, and the universe had basically said, you are rigidly adhered, even in death, you are rigidly adhered to your belief system in life, which was erroneous. If it's not on the path of higher intention, if it doesn't preach love, acceptance, forgiveness, mercy, compassion, if it doesn't preach those things, it is erroneous. And because you didn't, and because you're still in that mode of consciousness, somehow we have to knock that out of you. And why that's particularly interesting is because I also did, way back, Muhammad. I'd done Buddha, I'd done Jesus, I'd done saints and gurus, but I'd never done Muhammad. And the reason I didn't was because it's out of deference to Islam that you don't draw Muhammad. It's understood that you don't. If you want to try, then there are penalties for that. So I couldn't draw Muhammad. I didn't want to offend Muslims because that's not the plan here. This was simply an investigation. And so I did the pictures and then thought, I'm not going to say what they are. However, Muslims don't think of Muhammad as God. They think of him as a prophet who had like a hotline to God, to the angels, and was a disseminator of God's word because of that status. And of course, is one of the most influential leaders of all time. So when I did his pictures, I'll just tell you what they were, because they are interesting. When I did his pictures, he arrived in the metaphorical cave furious. Now, it turns out that he died relatively young by assassination, it's now thought. He ate some poisoned lamb, and with his wife at his side, actually died in her arms. So it's understandable that when he got to the cave I always see, he was angry, absolutely furious. His consciousness, which is all we're really talking about, his consciousness had a sword, and he was charging around, roaring at the injustice of being killed, when he had so much to offer in his own mind. And indeed, as he went up the tunnel, he got so far and then went back. No, I've got to teach the world that this is all wrong. Then he goes a little bit further, then goes back. And no, I'm not going up there. No, I've got work to do. I've got unfinished business. But he goes up a little further, and then the universe put a wall behind him, blocking off the tunnel, all the while steering him up towards the dome. Compare that to the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Remember, he's the guy that the Beatles consulted in London. He was the founder of transcendental meditation and helped spread that throughout the world. And was considered, he's a diminutive guy, but he was considered to be a great seer, as he was often called. And when I went into his pictures, he burst into the metaphorical cavern as if he'd been rushing to open a door, but it was already open and he just fell through it and landed on the floor. He too had a kind of, oh, so there's no going back now experience. Only he was filled with a certain amount of wonder. The process wasn't like he'd imagined. I remember he was wearing this white cloak thing, whatever it was. Not a jalaba, but some kind of white smock thing as he lay there. And he rolled over onto his stomach and looked around and was expecting something way more wondrous or spectacular or filled with lights or something. I'm not quite sure what he was expecting, but he was a little disappointed that way. But it didn't dampen his sense of wonder and enjoyment and calm. Because as he moved towards the tunnel and then up the tunnel, it was almost like he floated. He half walked, half floated, because there was very little to weigh him down. And he didn't have any sticks or rods or whirling butter things or whatever that other people had to strip the ego away. He seemed relatively centered and calm and accepting of this process. The only thing that did happen in his transition was that as he approached the light, remember this smock thing he was wearing? There was a sudden gust of wind that blew it off him, and it landed on the floor behind him. And he goes, but what? And the universe sort of goes, you don't need that either. Let that go too. His belief system, his rationale of what death was or where you go to after death or something like that. I don't know. But it was just blown off him. Poof. And now he could go. And he was light enough to lift. And he just floated into the dome and went. Fascinating, really. The contrast between the terrorists or even Muhammad and the Maharishi. So much less ego, in a way. And yet, Maharishi had reasons to be egotistical. I mean, he was famous and he was rich and he was successful and so on. But there was just something about him that got the formula right. So that except for that last bit of tribal script that he was wearing as he died, the belief system, except for that, he was very easy to lift. Now, halfway through doing transition pictures, I realized that with certain people, I can align with their consciousness and not only see what I'm seeing, which tends to be the same kind of images each time, but varied according to the person, but through their consciousness, I can see what they're seeing, how they're perceiving this process. And somebody said, why not go back and do Wayne Dyer's pictures and see what he was perceiving? Because if you remember, he had the easiest of transition. It was so full of wonder and so full of awe and validation of his beliefs that when he got up the tunnel, he didn't want to go, not because he was resistant to going, but because he wanted to savor every second and go back and teach people about how right he'd been about it all. But of course, he couldn't go back. But when I went into his consciousness, as he was in the chamber with the dome in, when I went into his consciousness and aligned with that, the whole chamber was filled with, I wanted to say orbs, but it wasn't really orbs. It was as though there was cotton candy floating in the air, forming an intermittent mist. But it was sort of illumined in some way. There was a glow to each piece. And when he looked out, he saw nothing but a room filled with this cotton candy, drifting in front of his eyes, making the process of crossing over into the light absolutely effortless, because this was almost like the light had come out to him. This felt like a part of the fiber of the dome itself. By accepting where he was, by being full of wonder and love, basically practicing what he preached, he was ready for the process of crossing over. Another one who was light enough to lift. There was so little he had to shed. He had a rough life in many respects, certainly in the early days. But as he got to the end of it, he had shed a lot of what had caused him problems in the past. And he was very, very much a believer in his own principles. But of course, it was all about letting go. That was the secret to this, letting go, which so many people are unable to do. They're convinced that they have power as they cross over on a level that they had when they were alive, which actually isn't true. Somebody that applies to is Walt Disney. And when I found him, I was expecting somebody fabulous. I was expecting magic and awe and wonder, because that's what he presented to the world. And I was completely wrong. That didn't happen at all. In fact, he arrived in the metaphorical cave almost like he was turning up for an awards ceremony. Something he was used to, or a meeting, something he just had to get out of the way, an inconvenience, an irritation. And he walked down some steps, adjusting his suit, making sure he looked right for the presentation that he was about to give, or the speech, or whatever it was. It was all about self-consciousness, presenting the right image, doing his best. And he treated this entire process like a business meeting. There was no emotional content. There was no observation. It was just like, bam, bam, bam. What do I have to do? Tell me and I'll get it over with. And he walked up the tunnel. The tunnel actually was long and steep, really steep, so that by the time he got to the top of it, he was out of breath. Now, he died of lung cancer, I think, certainly of some kind of respiratory collapse after being a heavy smoker all his life. But by the time he got to the top, he was disarmed. He was weakened. He was like, oh, God, oh. And then he saw the next stretch of tunnel, which went all the way down to the bottom where the dome was. And he just sat there for a little while and went, oh, God, okay. There was that moment where he realized, as so many do, that he can be master of his own domain when he's mortal, but in the hereafter, you lose that power. You become one with the whole. It's teamwork then. You're not a leader anymore. And it took him all this while to realize that he didn't have his hands on the steering wheel. It was over. And yet there was a formality, even to entering the dome, that would not be given up at all. He just behaved like it was moving from a meeting over there to a meeting over there. Come on, let's go, let's get in. Adjust your suit, open a curtain, and straight in. He was so ambitious and so business-minded that in the end that went straight over into the afterlife. And there was nothing magical about it at all. I was quite shocked. And finally, since we're talking about the attitude to crossing and privilege and so on, many people asked me to do Prince Philip, the Queen's husband who died this year. I did it at the time and I thought it was unremarkable, but people kept asking and I thought, okay, well, it's not that big a deal, but I will tell you and you can make of it what you will, really. But he arrived really, really tired. He was in his 90s. He'd had a long life and he was just weary. Unlike almost every other set of pictures I've done here, there was a little side tunnel up the left-hand side, and that's where he went. And it led to an anteroom where he stood and he waited and waited. He goes, well, where are the people? Why doesn't somebody meet me? Why doesn't somebody show me what to do? Why is there nobody here to look after me? But of course, you don't get that kind of privilege after you die. You don't have seniority. You're not royal after you die. You're the same as everybody else, which is what a lot of these people have learned. To their distress, very often. And he stood in this cavern, committed to the protocol of waiting that somebody would come and tell him what to do or guide him to where he needed to go. Normally, people are waiting for Jesus. He was waiting for, I don't know, help, a butler, somebody, whoever helped them. In the end, he realized that nobody was coming and walked back down the tunnel and then started his journey up the real tunnel. But he was exceedingly tired at a spiritual level. I don't know whether he was one of those people who hadn't fully lived his soul's path. Many people give up their soul's path in order to live a life of duty, in order to be something they're not, but that others expect them to be, which is often the case with royalty, which is why Harry and Meghan left, because they couldn't deal with that. Maybe Prince Philip was one of those who had sacrificed his true soul's path in order to fulfill his royal obligations. But as he got up the tunnel, he was extremely tired. This inner fight had all but weakened his spirit. Help! Somebody! I need help here! Somebody lend a hand! Please! And Grace did. Grace advanced and helped him up the rest of the tunnel, lifted him up and carried him to the top. Not necessarily because they recognized somebody in need, which has happened with us, people whose souls are crushed and they cannot make it to the end alone. It just felt like, okay, we better do this. He really is a spent soul. We need to replenish this guy. And he was so glad this was over. He couldn't have been happier that his life, this particular life, was done. Despite the money, despite the palaces, all the things that many people crave as a sign of stature and privilege and wealth, none of that actually mattered. By the time he reached the dome, there was very little ego left. That was spent in that antechamber where you go, oh, I see. Okay, I'm just a normal spirit crossing over. That was gone then. By the time he reached the light, he was pooped. Just worn out. And he relaxed into it. He didn't even step into it. He relaxed into it and said, goodbye, I'm done. Fell in and vanished into the light. So those are the different variations of pictures I didn't show you. None of them are that terrible, but some of them I just wasn't comfortable relaying to you. Others were incomplete. The Steve Jobs one I still don't quite get, although it did feel like it was unspent forgiveness or unresolved animosity and so on. That's what it felt like, that people were clawing onto his ankles. No, no, you can't go. We haven't forgiven you yet. But I guess we each have our own ego stuff to shed as we go. It's just not usually as extreme as it was for these people. All right, so that's it. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. Subscribe if you like. Like, share. Follow me on Twitter @CashPeters. That would be great. There's lots of stuff going on over there. Otherwise, I'll see you very soon, guys. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.